Hey everybody. So this is the first video installment of things that I'm going to do. I've done some other ones that have um, screen capture technology, but this one I'm actually going to be talking directly to you. So you get a sense of my voice and how I'm speaking and how I'm responding to things, because I know that like when you see the comments on the discussion board or the comments that I put in your grade book. Some people can take them in a different way than I say them. For example, if you see a score that doesn't seem to reflect what you thought you did, sometimes you can get a little bit defensive about what I've written, and that is totally natural and understandable. I do it all the time, and so I think it's really important to do this kind of video to make sure that people are kind of understanding exactly where I'm coming from. Just so you know, it is my birthday today, so I'm at home. I'm not in the office. Just wearing a t-shirt, hanging out, getting some work done, and so I took some notes as I was going through the discussion boards, particularly the ones related to refugee issues, and I wanted to address a few things because there's some stuff happening where people are saying things that directly contradict stuff that was presented in the readings that you were supposed to do. So if I see things that are assumptions or are claims that go against information that I've directly reported to you, I'm gonna challenge you on that. I'm gonna ask you to go back to the readings and take a look at some things. And so there's some things that popped up that I wanted to address. For example, interestingly, a lot of people mentioned that their first exposure to the idea of refugees was as a result of 9/11. And something that's really like fascinating to me personally is that no refugees were involved in 9/11. In fact, 15 out of the 19 people that committed those acts were from Saudi Arabia. They were part of Al Qaeda. And they had nothing to do with the refugee resettlement program, and they did not come to the United States as refugees. Refugees are the single most highly vetted group of people to come into the country, and they are probably the least of our worries because they've been through an extreme vetting, right? There's what Donald Trump's ideas, right? Extreme vetting. The interesting thing is that extreme vetting is already happening for people who go to the United Nations, are given refugee status, and then are resettled in another country. So it's really important to understand the difference between migrants, immigrants, illegal immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. Refugees are the most highly vetted of all those groups because they've come through a very specific United Nations process. So I wanted to clarify that a little bit. Something else that popped up a little bit was the idea of refugees being a burden on taxpayers or a burden on the educational system. And what most studies have found is that refugees, amongst nearly all groups receiving aid in the United States, particularly including people who already live here, are some of the most efficient dollars that are spent in terms of getting people into the workplace, being productive taxpayers, and being appreciative of where they're at. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, that's not true for every single person, but by and large, refugees take real advantage of the opportunities that they've been given because they've come from war-torn countries, they've come from famine, they've come from severe trauma. But unfortunately, in our media today, there's some really dangerous comparisons between refugees and terrorists and the conflation of refugees and terrorists. Here's an interesting fact. Since 1977, when the current model for refugee resettlement in the United States was implemented through the United Nations, there have been zero deaths, zero fatalities as a result of a terrorist attack by a refugee. Okay, so that's something really important to think about. That there was one, the Boston bombings, where the father of the two brothers who committed those acts was an asylum seeker, but the kids came as kids and were radicalized in the United States. So there are some like gray areas there. where sometimes people who were born here to refugees have been radicalized, but that also does not happen very often. By and large, refugees live peacefully in the United States and become Americans. They gain their citizenship and they love this country, typically. So that's something to keep in mind as well. I would recommend, like I mentioned earlier, to look up the differences between the words migrant, immigrant, illegal immigrant, asylum seeker, and refugee. And you'll see that the word refugee means something very, very specific. Okay. So, on that note, going back a little bit, what I need to see a little bit more of in the discussions are evidence from the readings. For example, if you've made this connection between 9/11 and terrorism and refugees, there are enough sources that I've provided to you to show that 9/11 had nothing to do with refugees. And so if I see somebody talking about my first introduction to the idea of refugees was through 9/11. That's quite possible, right? Because the media often conflates those things. However, it would be very important in your post to say, I understand that refugees had nothing to do with 9/11 based on the other evidence that I have. That's the kind of thing that I want to see as a connection. So show me that you did the readings. I sent out an email earlier today that also talks about some very specific things that you can do in order to show me that you have done the readings, you've analyzed the material, and now you're bringing it together, you're synthesizing it. So that act of analyzing and synthesizing are some of the most important things that you need to do over the course of the class. So something else to think about too is that idea of in Twin Falls they have that program where they support refugees, and it's a program that is government funded but run through the College of Southern Idaho, and I would argue that it is very much higher education's mission to broaden people's worldviews and to incorporate more cultures into the learning. So if you say, well, higher learning needs to focus on higher learning, you need to question, what is higher learning? How does this idea of refugees and this idea of a global community fit into the idea of a higher education? There's an article by Louis Mannan that you read earlier in the semester to kind of get an idea of how I teach, and it's based on those three theories of the purpose of higher education. One being that it's an intelligence test, shows that you're smart and capable. Two, being enlightening and empowering. And three, being specialized job training. If your only goal for college is to get specialized job training, say as a phlebotomist or as a physical trainer or something like that, then it's quite possible that you might miss out on the importance of the intelligence test. You need to show that you're capable, right? Or the enlightenment empowerment, which I personally think is the most important, is that education should be something that is a transformation of the self. Not just gaining a few skills to do a job, but it's actually a fundamental internal transformation. That's why we spend so much time in this class talking about identity and how we see things and testing our own ideas. So coming from that perspective, you may look differently at the idea of a refugee program being supported as a small part of the broader purpose of higher education. And it's also quite possible that human displacement is going to be the issue of the 21st century as populations grow and as resources become more scarce, particularly fuel and water. And those are both very directly tied to this idea of climate change. And so that's something to take into account as well, that refugee issues are global issues that tie into politics, that tie into resources, that tie into a lot of different things that will be very important in many of your jobs that you will get coming out of college. A lot of people mentioned, I don't know much about refugees. Well, here's your opportunity, right? I gave you a whole bunch of resources. So if you don't know much, get in there, dig around, get some information, look at the vetting process, look at objections to the idea of refugee resettlement, see what the possible risks are, see what, for example, the FBI is doing in order to increase vetting of refugees. I think you'll find that it's a pretty stout program, and it's very difficult to get through. And there's lots of red flags that go up, and people are not admitted to the United States if they have certain relationships to certain people who are connected to dangerous organizations. So we in this class, we're on the brink of discovery, right? This is your opportunity. You are required by the class and by the university to investigate things, work on critical thinking, analysis, synthesis, these ideas, and we're doing part of it through looking at global issues through the idea of displacement, because it ties into so many things. So we have the responsibility to use our sources in the class to develop a better understanding of this idea of a global community. So something else to do is when you're doing the readings, jot down quotes or type quotes that you can copy and paste into your responses. Think as you're reading, hey, this might be useful to me in what I'm going to write later, and then start incorporating summaries, paraphrases, direct quotes, the names of authors, the names of sources, people disagreeing about things. That's what I need to see in order for you to get full credit and to really do the heavy lifting and learning of this class. So, to sum up, right? Focus on analysis, breaking things apart into their component pieces and seeing how they work together, and synthesis, bringing those things back together in light of your own understanding and your own experiences, right? So that's what I need to see for really good responses. It's quite possible that you totally disagree with something that I've said, or something that a classmate says, or something that an article says. That's fine. Just back it up, right? That's what I need to see, is that analysis and synthesis, regardless of the conclusions that you've come to. So use evidence and show me that you did the readings carefully. Make references to as many of them as possible, especially going back to some of the ideas about identity, about privilege and disadvantage, about socialization, all of those things from early in the semester, because they will play into every single thing that we do over the course of this class. All right, sorry, this will probably be the longest video that I send you. If you're still here, nice job listening to me this whole time, and thank you for taking the class and participating. I look forward to your future posts. See you later.